All right, everyone, welcome to the 13th Daily Gwei AMA series. Hope you're all doing well. Today's episode's a bit different. We actually have a pop-up available, or will have a pop-up available for today's episode. Davey was kind of organizing that, so hopefully there'll be a link around soon to claim that. So really excited to see that kind of like shared. And obviously everyone loves to collect pop-ups, right? So for those of you who haven't been to the AMA before, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand and I'll see it come up on my requests here, or you can ask the question in the AMA series channel and I'll get to it towards the end. But this will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so if you have to leave early, you can watch it all on YouTube, and there'll be timestamps and everything like that to get through all of them. And on that note, I think I'm going to get started with questions from the AMA series channel, and at any time, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. So the first question here comes in from MD888, who asks, when Arbitrum and Optimism release their native tokens, will that contribute to the security of the network? What factors contribute to the security of these L2s? Does TVL affect security? So, I guess like taking a little bit of a step back here, the beautiful thing about these L2s and these rollups is that their security is actually Ethereum layer 1 security. So they directly inherit the Ethereum layer 1 consensus. So essentially, we currently on proof of work consensus, and then we'll move to proof of stake once the merge happens. But their security is tied to Ethereum layer 1. So when they issue a token and decentralize out their validators and sequences, that is not for security, that is more so for decentralization and for reliability, because right now both Arbitrum and Optimism have what's called a centralized sequencer and a centralized validator, where basically all the transactions that you do on those networks run through those kind of like validators and sequences. And if they were to go kind of like offline, then you wouldn't be able to do any transactions on the layer 2. You would still be able to get your funds back from layer 1 because of the fact that that's just the way the layer 2s work. They're secured by Ethereum. But that's why, when they do a token, that will contribute to the decentralization, because you can imagine people wanting to spin up their own validators and their own sequences to capture the fee revenue from the network, and they'll probably need to stake the token in order to do that. So for processing transactions, for doing the work, or for the layer 2 network, they'll be able to kind of like earn fee revenue for it, which I think is pretty cool. And there's also kind of like in some of these L2s, not so much Arbitrum and Optimism, but some other ones where the token not only leads to kind of like decentralizing out the kind of validators and sequences, but it also leads to kind of like having other features like slashing. So you can actually slash a validator if they were to do something kind of like malicious or not, or not be as reliable for these off-chain kind of like data availability committees. So you'll have heard me talk about a lot on the refill before, like Validium from Starkware and ZK Porter from ZK Sync. These they still inherit their security from Ethereum, but they keep the data off chain. Now, if you want to incentivize people to like keep data for longer, you will obviously have like a token, and they can stake this token and earn fees for keeping the data available and making sure people can always kind of access that data. But also, you would like to punish people who do something malicious, like withhold the data from users or kind of like censor users and stuff like that. So there are other uses for the token there, of course, as well. And then some of these L2s may decide that their token is a governance token, right? And say, well, basically, we still need to be able to upgrade the chain and add new kind of like functionality to it. So let's just have a token that acts as a governance token as well. Now, I don't know if any of the L2s will be doing governance with their tokens. I am just like saying that could be a use case, but I haven't seen anything from any of the L2s yet. And you asked what factors contribute to the security. Basically, Ethereum layer 1, when the L2 is constructed correctly, of course, it can be constructed incorrectly, where the L2 could basically not post fraud proofs to layer 1, which means that it is not secured by Ethereum. So, and I think Optimism doesn't post fraud proofs right now. I think they will in the near future, but they just don't do it right now. And I've mentioned before how Arbitrum and Optimism in their current states are pretty centralized. Like they're in beta, they're at really early stages, and they're keeping it quite centralized because of that. And they're pretty open about that as well. They're not trying to hide that or anything like that. So, but that's just the current iteration. Obviously, as we move through the rollout of these things and and the adoption of it, they'll decentralize over time as well. And then your last question, does TVL affect security? I mean, not directly, in a roundabout way. I mean, it might, because I guess like something with a high TVL has like it's a kind of bigger honeypot for attackers. So if an attacker says, well, okay, there's like $1 billion in this L2, is there any way to kind of exploit this to drain these $1 billion? Now they probably wouldn't put in the same effort for an L2 that had like $10 million in it or something like that, right? So I guess like the bigger the honeypot, the more effort someone will put in to try and exploit it. But it doesn't affect security in the sense that it doesn't matter how much TVL you have, you would still be inheriting Ethereum security as an L2. So hopefully that answers your questions, MD888. All right, next question comes from Next Tech, who says, when referring to smart contracts on Ethereum as money Legos, does that mean that any smart contract can interact with any other smart contract permissionlessly? Or would a newly built smart contract still need to have some form of permission to interact with a different one? I'm trying to wrap my head around Web3 APIs, and it would help if you could give an overview as to how smart contracts from different teams can interact with each other. So the term money logos describes exactly what you said. Basically means that all these smart contracts, specifically DeFi smart contracts, can interact with each other, compose with each other, and interoperate with each other. Now, they can do this permissionlessly only if the other contract doesn't have like a whitelist. So for example, there are some protocols that will have a whitelist of which contracts can interact with them. An example of this would be something like the Iron Bank that the Yearn ecosystem had, where basically they allowed certain protocols to borrow under collateralized, or to take out under collateralized loans from Cream, and other protocols couldn't do that. So I think that Alpha Finance was able to do it, but other protocols weren't. So there are instances where the protocol will basically say, well, we're not totally permissionless for other ones to interact with, and we have like a whitelist or something like that. But in the normal case, mostly everything is kind of like interoperable and composable with each other. And the perfect example of this is, for example, using Uniswap LP tokens as collateral in Maker to draw DAI. That's an example of composability. And actually, now that I think of it, the perfect example is something like a flash loan, where essentially you can basically borrow funds from a money market, and that enables flash loans such as Aave. Borrow those funds and use those funds to do whatever you want on Ethereum, and as long as you pay those funds back in the same block, you'll be able to kind of like take that loan without putting up any collateral. So for example, you'd be able to borrow like $500 million from Aave, do whatever you want with that $500 million on the chain. You could do arbitrage transactions, you could do an exploit, of course, you could do a bunch of different things, and as long as you're able to pay back that full amount in the same Ethereum block, and the fee, there's a little bit of a fee kind of like associated with it, then you are basically able to take that out completely with zero collateral. Because essentially what happens is that if you don't repay it in the same Ethereum block, then the entire transaction reverts. And flash loans to this day is still one of the coolest things, I think, that Ethereum has, and one of the coolest ways to show Ethereum's composability as well. So the kind of like, I guess, comparison to like APIs in general is that like if something isn't like an open API, then obviously anyone can build on it and kind of like interoperate with other things built on it. But unfortunately, a lot of APIs these days are closed off or require kind of like subscriptions or are rate limited or kind of stuff like that. Facebook is pretty famous for basically kicking developers off their APIs and killing a lot of the early Facebook apps that were built on there, because Facebook was basically like, well, we don't want this because we want to centralize everything within us. Whereas on Ethereum, everything can be built permissionlessly and everything can just like leverage everything else, which I think is really, really cool. So yeah, hopefully that kind of like shed some high level light on, I guess, composability, money Legos within Ethereum and how they all kind of like work together and play together. All right, question here from Who. Hey Anthony, have you considered shorting every time you're about to tweet something euphoric about ETH? It's amazing that it seems to dump every time you do. No, I haven't considered shorting ETH. I don't think I could physically bring myself to short ETH no matter what. Even if I was convinced ETH was going to drop in price for whatever reason, I don't think I could short ETH. And it's funny, like there's a book by Nassim Taleb called Fooled by Randomness, and I think it applies like so perfectly to my tweets, because like I tweet a lot about, I guess, like the ETH price and stuff like that, and if you actually map them out on the chart, a lot of the time it doesn't actually affect the price at all, but because I usually am tweeting out something really bullish when the price of ETH is going up, it's more likely than not that the price is going to come down after that because the price has already been going up. Like, for example, I tweeted the other day when ETH first kind of touched all-time high, it was more likely that ETH was probably going to dump off all-time high after it had just run up to it than, if I tweet when ETH is kind of like, I tweet something really bullish when ETH is kind of like dumping in price, for example. So I think that's why that sort of stuff happens, but it is amazing the hit rate there. I think maybe just in general, I need to not post anything when ETH is going up in price. It's hard though, because I like it when ETH is going up in price. I like celebrating all-time highs and stuff like that. But no, definitely haven't considered shorting. One here from Handasa Tak who says, why is everyone on Twitter asking you to dance? So this is another one, another thing that I kind of like promised or kind of like did around ETH price movements that I kind of like regret now. So there's this woman who did a dance about Bitcoin called the Bull 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 dance or something like that, and it was like some really, I mean, I watched it and I felt it was a little bit cringy. She basically sings about Bitcoin and about how like Michael Saylor is bullish, and it was just really awkward and cringy, and I think that was done on purpose. And one night I was lying in bed and ETH was what was it? It was like $700 or something like that, and I think or $800 or something, or maybe a bit more than that. I can't remember the exact price, but it was January of this year, and I basically said if ETH gets to its all-time high in January, which was 1400 or 1420, I'll do that dance, and I'll basically sing and dance like that woman did, and of course ETH got to all-time high in January, and I didn't do the dance, and now everyone has been bugging me about it for a long time now because they want me to do it. Maybe one day I'll do it. I just haven't done it. It's I can't bring myself to do something so awkward and cringy. But I'm gonna have to do it, and maybe I'll do it when ETH is 10k or something like that. But that's the context around why everyone keeps bringing that up. I know I'm never gonna live it down as well, and that's the thing. I should just do it and get it out of the way. But if you actually saw the dance that the woman did and what she did in that video, it's very cringy and very awkward. So you probably understand why I don't want to do it. But hopefully that gives the context there. So your second question, Handasa, you ask, Dankrad Feist on the Zero Knowledge podcast has mentioned that after statelessness, Ethereum would probably become more centralized because very few individuals will be incentivized to run a block builder node compared to a block proposer. Do you think that is worrying? So I haven't listened to that podcast actually myself, and I wouldn't consider myself to be, as up to speed on stateless Ethereum as I would like to be. There's a lot of moving parts to it. There's a lot of ongoing research. I would kind of like say that take anything that researchers kind of like say around stateless Ethereum right now with a grain of salt, because a lot can change. A lot has already changed with other parts of Ethereum. For example, with sharding, for the longest time, people thought that we were going to do execution sharding, and now that's kind of like off the roadmap, and we're just doing data sharding. So, just as an example of things changing quite quickly in this ecosystem. So I would say that just maybe keep up to date with the research going on with stateless Ethereum, maybe get involved even if you'd like, but I just generally haven't kept up as much as I would want to. I think that's also because I know that it's rapidly changing, and for someone who obviously isn't working full-time on stateless Ethereum, it doesn't really make much sense for me to pay attention to it like so granularly, because I know that things are going to change, and I just feel like it's not really a good use of my time to follow along with stuff that's just going to change rapidly. So I haven't really paid too much attention there, and as I said, I haven't listened to that podcast yet. So I mean, hopefully that gives you a bit of color around around that, but I'm not sure about the actual question itself about kind of like these Ethereum becoming more centralized because only very few individuals will be incentivized to run a block builder node. I think in the current state that might be true, but there's probably going to be a different state once it gets to mainnet, because I think stateless Ethereum won't be even considered for mainnet until 2023 at the earliest, and it might even push into 2024. We have to see how it all plays out but I think that if it does go to mainnet in this iteration where it can centralize within very few individuals, then yeah, it becomes worrying, right? But I think that just based on obviously all the past research and developments happened within Ethereum, the developers and the researchers definitely want to find a solution that doesn't centralize things. But there are trade-offs as well at the end of the day. So yeah, hopefully that kind of like gives a bit of color there. Sorry I couldn't totally answer the question for you. So a couple of questions here from Yon the Fawn, who says, You mentioned you use Gnosis Safe and have a bunch of multi-sig wallets. Would you mind explaining why you have so many wallets in general, and could you give an example of why you would want to create a multi-sig wallet? So, the main use of kind of like Gnosis Safe for me right now, and why I am on so many multi-sig wallets, is because there are various kind of like projects in the ecosystem that I'm a signer for. So I'll kind of like sign a transaction, or sign a message or whatever as part of like these DAOs and stuff like that. And I have like a multi-sig wallet for ETHUB with Eric Connor. He's my co-founder. We have kind of like funds in there, and obviously it's a multi-sig because there's two of us. So I guess like probably answers your second question as well. It's like why you would want to create a multi-sig wallet. Well, if you have like a wallet with funds in it that are shared between various people, or if it's shared between like a DAO, for example, which is obviously more than just a few people. It's a lot of people. You would want there to be a multi-sig on there to ensure that not one person could just like drain the funds. And there's different ways to do multi-sigs. You can do like a 2 of 3, where only you can have 3 signers on the multi-sig wallet, but only 2 of them need to sign transactions or messages for them to be executed. Or you could have like a 5 of 7, or like an 8 of 10, or whatever. I'm pretty sure you can construct it in any which way that you want, and you can go pretty hard with it as well. Like I think the WBTC smart contract has like 21 signers on it or something like that. I think it's 21 because if you get the referencing 21 million Bitcoin, then it becomes really hard to kind of like coordinate, right? Like if you've got 15 of 21, you have to coordinate 15 people to sign a transaction, and it just becomes, a little bit difficult to do that like that. So yeah, that is why you would want to have a multi-sig wallet. And the reason I'm on so many is because I kind of like help out different ecosystem projects, and I guess like I'm a trusted and known community member, so they would rather have people like me on the multi-sig rather than just a random person, really. Your second question, an L2 index token seems like the perfect play for your theory about L2s being one of the best investments you could make in the next 5-10 years. Any ideas if Index Coop has it in the product roadmap? I don't know if they've got it in the product roadmap. I would assume that they're thinking about it for sure, because it is something that definitely is going to interest a lot of people. But the problem is that obviously a lot of the L2s don't have tokens right now. There's very few of them actually that have tokens, and there's very few of them that have tokens that are. There's even fewer of them that have tokens that are actually performing well. Because obviously when you want to buy an index or want to buy one of these tokens, you want things that at least perform kind of like well over time. So I would say that we would have to wait for more of these L2s to release tokens. You did note that here in your question as well. You say once more L2s release tokens. So I think that it will come once at least. I mean, I don't know how many you want. Like if you say Arbitrum, Optimism, ZK Sync, Starkware, Polygon already has a token, obviously with Matic. That's 5, right? You could probably go with 5, but there's others out there that already have tokens as well that are just smaller. Like for example, you've got I guess like you've got Immutable X that are going to be coming out with a token very very soon. IMX, DYDX has a token as well, but it gets a bit different because IMX could be considered like an NFT token, for example, right? Rather than an L2 token. And then you have DYDX, which could be considered a DeFi token instead of an L2 token. And there's Loopring, which is, again, more DeFi than L2, Diversify, more DeFi than L2. So I would say that you would want to stick to the infrastructure itself, where, I feel like Immutable X could still fit into that. But I'm just looking at the list now. Like you could say that, what is there? Seller Network with kind of like their bridging and stuff like that. And you have like, could you include the bridges in that as well? Like bridges are a big part of the L2 ecosystem. It just becomes a little bit murky there of what tokens you would include. But I would say it would make a lot more sense once those kind of like 5 premier L2 generalized platforms had tokens. So yeah, I assume Index Coop is going to do it once there's more tokens to put into there. All right, a question here from Kirag, who says, can you share some context on ScottLewis and MonetSupply's comments on UST and Terra? I haven't seen the ETH community publicly call out Terra before, so I was a bit surprised. And you're referencing this tweet from ScottLewis, who is, I guess, quote tweeting MonetSupply, who says, UST is fundamentally broken and everyone shilling it is going to end up looking either incompetent or shady in hindsight. So I'm not going to put words in MonetSupply or ScottLewis's mouth here. I'm not going to speak for them. I am going to try and explain where I see kind of like the issues with UST that I've seen other people talk about and kind of like articulate them. So I think the biggest issue people have is that it is an algorithmic stablecoin. Obviously, we've seen a lot of algorithmic stablecoin projects play out over the last, I guess, 12 months. And pretty much most of them have either gone to zero or like, there was very popular ones like ESD and DSD and stuff like that didn't work at all, or there are a lot of them that actually aren't stable at all, right? Some of them don't advertise themselves as a stable coin, other ones do, but I don't think that applies to UST right now because UST, from what I've seen, is pretty stable and it works quite well. But I think the issue becomes is that the way UST minting and kind of like redeeming works is that you have to basically, I guess technically they call it like a burn, but I don't really like calling it a burn. But essentially what you have to do is you quote unquote burn Luna to mint UST, and then if you want to get it back, you can kind of like do a redemption. Now I'm not across like all the intricacies of the system. That is kind of like a very high level from how I understand it. Now, where this becomes a problem is that if there's, say, like a massive kind of like bank run on the stablecoin, or if the price of Luna drops really rapidly, it could lead to a depegging event for UST, and it could lead to a lot of instability within UST as a stablecoin. Now, we've actually already seen this happen once before, and it happened back when the May 2021 crash happened, where we had that massive crash where everything came down. There was a massive deleveraging event, and I think Luna, the token, crashed pretty hard. And because of that, it people were kind of like trying to do arbitrage and to redeem and to kind of like do arbitrage against UST, and the peg broke pretty heavily. I think it went down to either 60 or 70 cents or something like that because there was like there was too much kind of instability because the market just went absolutely crazy. Now, people were saying, this could lead to a death spiral when this happens, where it just basically feeds in on itself in a negative feedback loop. It didn't lead to that from what I saw. And it seems to have recovered quite well. But then there's been other concerns around, who's market making UST? Is it like, is there only a centralized group of people that are market making this thing, and without them would the UST peg also falter? It could be that. I don't know. I haven't looked into that. But as I said, I'm just bringing up the concerns that I've seen raised before. I don't think MonetSupply ever followed up on their tweet with what is actually fundamentally wrong with it. And they do kind of like work. I think they do. They are pretty active within the maker ecosystem. So, some people will say, oh, that's it. It's just a conflict of interest there. It's just people trying to FUD UST and Terra and things like that. I don't know. As I said, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth here. But those are the concerns that I've seen brought up over time about it. And it seems to be working right now. Who knows if it's going to work long term? I mean, the best we can do is just wait and see. There's literally, for a lot of these things, they can work for a very long time, and then one day they can just stop working. So we'll have to just see how that plays out in the future. So hopefully that gives you a bit of color around that. And, maybe you can, I guess, tweet at MonetSupply, or maybe kind of like ask around in the Terra ecosystem and see if you could get any kind of like actual bear cases for UST and how it's fundamentally broken and things like that. So yeah. All right, a question here from Sponge, who says, can you give a TLDR on Tokemak? I think that's how you say it, please, and maybe how it relates to OM and or protocol-owned liquidity. So I would say that I'm not the best person to ask about Tokemak and to get a TLDR or an explain like I'm 5 about. From what I know, it's basically a way to, at least from a high level, it's trying to reverse the, I guess, like liquidity incentive mechanism so that it goes from being mercenary to actually beneficial to a project. Now, an example of this is, as you mentioned, protocol-owned liquidity, where instead of a protocol paying out massive token incentive rewards for liquidity, they instead sell tokens in like what Olympus Pro does with their bonds, for example. And they sell tokens for LP tokens. So essentially, the protocol starts owning their own liquidity provider tokens, which means they own their own liquidity, and they don't have to pay out as much to bootstrap that liquidity. Because obviously, when the DAO or the protocol owns its own liquidity, it can just keep it in there indefinitely if it wanted to, and it doesn't need to worry about the liquidity being pulled out of the different pools because of the fact that there's no token incentives being paid out or impermanent loss or whatever or anything like that. I mean, obviously, obviously it's going to suffer impermanent loss as well. But if you're the DAO, the treasury, you don't really care as much as an individual, for example. So I'm actually really, really bullish on protocol-owned liquidity as a concept generally. I think it is the most quote-unquote DeFi 2.0 thing in DeFi 2.0. I don't really, I hate the term really because it's just a marketing term. But I would say that protocol-owned liquidity is one of the most innovative things that I've seen in the DeFi space in quite a while now. And I think that a lot of projects should be at least experimenting with it as part of kind of like the liquidity bootstrapping. And I think that's what Tokemak offers projects as well, just an easy way to do this. And I know a lot of people are excited about that project right now because of that. So yeah, I guess like that's an overview there for you. As I said, not an expert on Tokemak, but there are a few experts actually in the Discord channel. So if you ask around, maybe in the DeFi channel, someone may answer your question there as well. All right, one here from Project 2501 who says, off topic, but what was the first thing you did after escaping lockdown? So I haven't actually done anything yet. So I think my fiance went back to work because she works in hospitality. And obviously restaurants and stuff opened up after lockdown, but I haven't actually done anything. I plan to do something. I plan to go into the city, sometime soon. But really, my whole life is basically at my PC because obviously I work from home. I work in the Ethereum ecosystem. I do a lot of stuff online. And I don't really have too much of a reason to leave the house. I mean, I went and saw my mum the other day, and my dad comes over from time to time, but and actually, that was probably the first thing I did after escaping lockdown. But that was like a week after lockdown ended, which was funny enough. So yeah, I haven't really done much there. Maybe I'm just a boring person, but for me, I prefer to travel kind of overseas rather than within the country. I've already done a lot in Melbourne, like over the years, and not to say it's a boring city, but like I love traveling, especially going to like ETH conferences and stuff like that. So I'm just waiting to be able to do that, which will probably be next year at this stage. I don't believe there's any conferences besides NFT NYC, which I won't be able to get to as that's early November, and I don't think international travel opens until like probably just after that conference. Last time I saw like 5th of November or something like that. But I'm definitely going to go to ETH Denver in February. I'm really, really looking forward to that one. Funny enough, that was the last conference I went to before COVID hit. So gone through the whole bull market in my little study here that you guys watch on the Refuel. And it'd be really, really fun to meet all the people that I've become friends with over the last 2 years. So yeah. All right, so MIDI has a few different questions here. How are exchanges going to offer Ethereum via L2s? Are they covering the bridging costs from L1 to L2, or will buying ETH be a bit more expensive on Coinbase once they add support for L2s? So I don't know the specific implementations that they're going to be using, but here there's a couple of different ways they can do it. So they're going to have to bridge from L1 to L2. So they don't have to do that. So maybe I should just go through the options. They can either bridge from L1 to L2 for their users. They can have a reserve on L2 that they basically have like a pool of capital that's like in the Coinbase account on L2, and then they just kind of like do some off-chain accounting where a user basically says, hey, I want to withdraw 1 ETH from Coinbase to Optimism, and then Coinbase basically deducts that 1 ETH from the user's balance on Coinbase and credits them on Optimism using Coinbase's ETH, their ETH stash on Optimism already. So they don't have to have like a ETH stash on layer 1, it can be on layer 2. And that'll be their kind of like hot wallet that they use for users. Or they can bridge directly, obviously, from L1 to L2, which is not capital efficient at all. So I actually think they're going to go the path of just having a reserve on L2 and being able to do it that way. Or they can do batch transactions where they can basically pool all the user withdrawals together if there's enough of them, and they'll only have to pay kind of like one transaction fee on layer 1. And this is what Seller Network does actually with their public transportation system that they're calling it. And then, bring it till L2 and then distribute it out on L2. I think the path of least resistance is probably just going to be that reserve, where essentially Coinbase says, okay, well, we're going to send like 100,000 of our hot wallet ETH to L2 because we see, to Optimism, for example, because we see Optimism has a lot of users that want to go in and out, and we're just going to do the accounting through our own systems to keep track of which ETH is going where and who's got what ETH. So is pretty much a solved problem. I think it just requires the exchanges to build this stuff and to build the systems and to have the infrastructure in place. And, Coinbase has already said that they're going to be supporting the Polygon POS chain as a first kind of like scalability solution, and then supporting the other L2s like Arbitrum, Optimism, I think they said Starkware, and I'm sure they're going to support others as well there. So yeah, that's how I kind of like envision them doing it. And your second question, any thoughts on atomic composability issues? I've read a little bit on it and how the layer method of scaling can make it much more difficult to do things like DeFi, as it can cause transactions to simply be dropped in their current state rather than reverted. This can result in users holding assets in places they otherwise wouldn't want to. I'm specifically trying to wrap my head around this post from Vitalik, which is on ETH Research, called Cross-Shard DeFi Composability. Apologies if this is obvious to other people, but would an ETH2 ERC20 token, as you envision it, require a copy of the contract to exist on every shard, or is there some technique I've overlooked for supporting a token on all chains with only a single contract on one shard? So the post that you're reading, I remember this post. Vitalik posted this when DevCon Osaka was going on. I remember reading this. This is old. It doesn't apply to sharding as it will exist in Ethereum. So the post you were referring to was when there was like execution sharding on the roadmap. Now, that's completely off the roadmap as far as I know. I don't think that's going to be a thing. So we only have data sharding on that coming to Ethereum. What that means is that there are going to be no kind of like smart contracts or execution happening on these shards. The shards will basically be data availability layers for layer 2s. So the layer 2s will be where things like ERC20 contracts and tokens and kind of like all that, or DeFi contracts and all that sort of stuff happen. So what you're kind of like referencing here, as I said, is an older post, and it doesn't apply to the Ethereum going forward. But also you're kind of like talking about, I guess, composability across not just sharding, but layer 2s. And I think there are a few different solutions for this. There are the bridging protocols, obviously, which help a lot with that. But there's also the arbitrary message relay protocols, like Rari Capital is building Nova, and Starkware is building the DAMM. And there's a few others out there as well, I think, that are coming online now. And basically what they allow you to do is that they allow you to send arbitrary messages across L2s. So you can imagine being able to send a message from Optimism and say, hey, I want to trade X amount of ETH for X amount on Uniswap, but I want to source the liquidity from Arbitrum instead of Optimism. So essentially, you can execute a trade from Optimism using liquidity in Arbitrum, and then it all settles back on Optimism for you, which I think is awesome, and I think is actually mind-blowing, because that does rectify the composability issues that happen when you start splitting up liquidity and splitting up contracts like on the L2. So yeah, hopefully that answers that part of your question. But as I said, the post that you're referencing, if I've got it right, like if I just bring up the post, I just want to make sure, like I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, but October 2019, exactly, DevCon Osaka. This post is not, it doesn't apply to Ethereum, to sharding on as it will exist on Ethereum in the future. Another question here from Yawn the Fawn. What is the Island Boi meme, and what does it have to do with crypto? I don't think it actually has anything to do with crypto. I think it was just one of those kind of like TikTok things where people could maybe just like pay them to do a dance or like some I don't know, some kind of like song, and people pay them to do it about crypto. As far as I know, it just kind of like has nothing directly to do with crypto. But I'm maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of like my impression of it. I didn't really look into it because it felt a little bit silly. It felt like it's a bit of a silly meme. But yeah, hopefully that answers that. All right, a few here from Javier Lux, who says, questions about NFTs for business. All of us were shocked by the August NFT storm in Ethereum. It was great to see such massive usage of the network done by these NFT for artists. Since then, I'm very interested in NFT for businesses. I saw some very promising projects and would like to know your opinion about them. So you list a few projects here. A couple of projects. I haven't looked into either of these. So you've listed Boson Protocol, and you've listed Cargo X. So I think Cargo X is what is Cargo X here? Actually, I should go over Boson Protocol first. Let me just load up the website so I can know what I'm talking about here. So it calls itself the decentralized network to enable future commerce. I think I've seen this before. I'm not exactly 100% sure what they do, so I can't really answer that. I think they may kind of like sell different kind of like services and stuff like that as well. And then your second one here is Cargo X, which, if I'm correct, it should be a supply chain kind of like protocol or something like that. So no, it's okay, it's document transfer. Okay. All right, so I guess like I should focus on basically just the meta topic here, which is NFTs for businesses and how businesses can tap into this stuff. I think so. I mean, we can define what an NFT is, right? Non-fungible token. It is basically a representation of a unique thing, and businesses have lots of unique things, right? Like documents, as you've got in the Cargo X thing here, data like hash data that is unique and stuff like that. So I think that the kind of like use cases there are pretty obvious, and I think that we're going to see more and more of these businesses kind of use this stuff. They do need the infrastructure as well. They need kind of like probably layer 2 stuff. They can't do this stuff on layer 1, so. And they need purpose-built infrastructure as well, from what I can tell. So maybe something like what EY built with Nightfall, which is like a purpose-built kind of enterprise-grade privacy roll-up. I think that's something that they would need for NFTs for these businesses and stuff like that. But I'm not, as I said, I'm not familiar with the project that you've listed, and I haven't really paid too much attention to this stuff. I think there hasn't really been any major success story yet, and I think that's why people aren't really paying too much attention, is because the model still needs to be proved, and like the demand still needs to be proved. Like, is there actually a demand for businesses to do this? I think there will be. I just think that we're still pretty early in kind of like this area, so I will be keeping an eye on it for sure, but definitely not something that I've kind of like looked into too deeply at this stage. And yeah, your third question was, are you aware of any NFT for business projects getting traction now or soon that you think we should pay attention? Yeah, as I said, like I'm not aware of any that have kind of like gotten a lot of traction yet, or kind of, or at least has come across my radar, but I'll definitely keep an eye out for you. All right, one here from bohash.eth, who says, you often talk about the data availability scaling via shards, and that the possible number of shards basically depends on the decentralization of the network, aka the number of validators. But is it the only requirement that enables adding more shards? What about the beacon chain? Wouldn't there be a bottleneck? I actually don't know. It just seems like magic that we actually can scale that way. This is the funny thing. It actually does seem like magic, right? We spoke about like I guess like the ecosystem in general spoke about the scalability trilemma for a long time, right? Where you couldn't get all three: scaling, security, and decentralization. But with the with kind of like what Ethereum is doing with sharding, you can get all three. You can invert that trilemma and basically be able to get more scale with the more decentralization that you have. So essentially, the way it works is that when data sharding is kind of like put into the network, validators will be shuffled randomly across all the shards in groups, and I can't remember the exact number of validators that will be assigned to each shard, but I think the more the merrier. And I'm not sure if the numbers have been finalized yet, but you can see how that extends to, if we have more validators, then we can have more shards, right? Like if we have say we have 250,000 validators today, say that can support 100 shards, for example. Now what happens if we double the amount of validators on the network? Well, that means we can support 200 shards, right? And we can essentially double the capacity, the data availability capacity for layer 2s. Now I don't think it's like that simple. I don't think it's like one-to-one mapped. I do think you can play around with the validator numbers and how many validators actually need to be validating shards over time. But that's essentially how it works. So it's not magic. It actually works like on the technical level. It makes sense on the technical level as well. And the beacon chain basically coordinates all of this. And I think the reason why you would want more validators and you don't want to spread the validators out too thin is got to do with not overloading the beacon chain as well, because the beacon chain keeps kind of like track of all of this sort of stuff. We want to be able to keep the chain in consensus and make sure that there's no instability there. So we want to be able to have like as many validators per shard as possible, and then go from there. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm going to take a quick break, guys. I'll be back in a minute or so. All right, on to the next question. So, one here from Dom who says, when do you think one Gwei will be worth one USD? If I'm doing my math right here, and if I'm remembering correctly, one Gwei is like 1 billionth of an ETH, which means that for one Gwei to be worth one USD, ETH would need to be $1 billion. So, if I'm doing my math correctly, and if I'm remembering correctly there, so I don't know, if the USD collapses and hyperinflates, maybe ETH goes to $1 billion. So, and then one Gwei becomes worth one USD. All right, a couple of questions from Max Invests. First one, what are the risks on using HOP protocol? If I withdraw my funds from the L2 onto the L1 using HOP, are they totally secure once they reach the L1? So the way HOP protocol works is that essentially it gives you kind of like it kind of like has a liquidity pool that sits between the L1 and L2 and different kind of like L2s, and you kind of go through this liquidity pool, and essentially you get like issued these H tokens, which is like basically an IOU on the token, and then you get kind of like issued the token on the chain that you're transferring your assets to, for example. I guess the risks would be that like the risks, I'm pretty sure Hop Protocol would have centralized controls in place right now, so that's a risk, of course. They probably have like a multisig or something like that, considering it's really early. Another risk would be that maybe your trade, or I guess your exchange gets front run or sandwich attacked, and you lose out on kind of like slippage and stuff like that, because as I said, like it is a decentralized exchange, an exchange between different layers there. But I'm not too up to speed on Hop's architecture itself and what other risks kind of like are present there. But generally with these kind of like bridges, most of them have like centralization risks around the fact that they have like multi-sigs and things like that. So I'm not 100% sure on Hop. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview there. Second question, can you explain Ohm to me like I'm 5? Well, I think I touched on it just earlier about Ohm and kind of like protocol owned liquidity and things like that. But essentially, Ohm, I mean, I touched on their product before, Olympus Pro, which basically allows projects to sell bonds in order to, in order to kind of like bootstrap their liquidity and get their liquidity into their protocol, into their treasury, so they could have protocol owned liquidity. But the way Ohm works itself, and I may be wrong here, but I'm gonna do my best to explain it like I'm 5. It's a rebasing token. So basically, every time it rebases, it essentially rebases and puts its kind of like the difference in the rebase, or I guess like profit, I guess you could call it, into its treasury. So it basically has like a treasury that acts as the final backstop. So you could basically say, well, if the treasury has like $500 million in it, which I think it does actually. Last time I checked, it had a lot of money in it actually. You could say that you could always redeem, the entire kind of like supply of Ohm for that. So there is kind of like a floor on the price. Now, I think the kind of like fully diluted value of Ohm is $4 billion or something like that. So there's a premium there, right, compared to what's in the treasury, and that premium gets rebased away over time. But as long as the demand keeps coming, as long as people keep buying it, then the premium can stay very, very high. So hopefully that explains it like I'm 5. Hopefully I didn't get that wrong or butcher that. As I said, I'm not an expert on Olympus or Ohm. I also think that there's a lot of criticism that gets lobbied towards them as well about this mechanism, saying that it's unsustainable, that it's Ponzi-like. I don't really know or buy into that. Like, I don't know enough about it to have like a strong opinion either way. It does seem a little Ponzi-like at first, but I think that it's been around for a while. I mean, the other day actually was funny. There was kind of like a crash where basically it was a massive negative feedback loop that crashed the price of Ohm pretty quickly, but then it came back up because people just came in and bought it. So I think it has like similar market dynamics to just like any token, but also has like the interesting kind of rebasing mechanism that puts the liquidity and kind of puts the value into the treasury as well. So it builds like a really, really strong treasury over time, which I think is pretty cool. I mean, there are a lot of forks of Ohm now that try to do that too. There's obviously KlimaDao, which I've talked about before on the refuel, that is trying to basically use that mechanism for good. And it was funny, we were actually talking about this in the Discord channel. It's one of the Discord channels the other day, I think it was yesterday, about making like an fork that basically collected tokens into its treasury and then paid these tokens out to like Ethereum core developers. So that's what I like about the idea as well, is that if people want to play these degen games or these kind of like money games, as I like to call them, and they can, like, there's nothing wrong with it, but let's like see if we can do it for good. Like let's put this money towards something good instead of just speculation. So that's actually one thing I'm really interested in when it comes to Ohm and Olympus in general, is kind of like harnessing that. And there's nothing saying that Olympus can't use their treasury for that either. That'd be really cool if they did that, if they put some money towards things like Ethereum public goods and Ethereum core developers. But yeah, I think the reason why it's so popular is because the game is very reflexive in either direction. So, reflexive being like it can go up really quickly, and you can have like people advertising 100,000% APY because, the value kind of gets fed back into token holders, as well as kind of like the treasury. And then you can have the other way where it's kind of like it can crash really, really quickly because people just like exit, and then it kind of like goes into this negative feedback loop as well. So, I mean, maybe that's not an explain like I'm five explanation there. As I said, like I don't think I'm up to speed with it enough to explain it like on a very, very simple level. But I'm sure, if you ask in the DeFi Discord channel or something like that, someone more experienced than me can definitely help you there and probably answer it better than I can. All right. So a related question actually from a Rob Dog, who says, what are your thoughts on the regenerative climate finance ecosystem emerging in Web3? Last week, Toucan bridged over 8 million tons of CO2 into Web3 to support Klima, and carbon is now being integrated into all the T1 protocols. Crypto solving climate change seems like a good way to change the narrative and fend off regulation. So I don't think crypto will solve climate change. I don't think like any one individual or kind of entity will solve climate change. I think what crypto can do, and as I was alluding to before and saying before, is that crypto can basically redirect a lot of the degenerate gambling activity or speculation that exists within the ecosystem to things like public goods, or to fighting climate change, or to donating funds to political parties, and to advocating and lobbying and bribing and stuff like that. That can definitely happen, and we've seen it happen in pockets across the ecosystem. Like obviously Gitcoin plays a big role there. We've seen it happen with Optimism donating all the profits from their sequencer to public goods, and they're donating $1 million right now, and there's more to come from where that came from. Klima obviously forked Olympus and is kind of like trying to fight off climate change and trying to get more people kind of like involved there. And I mean, I'm just really bullish on that concept in general. I think I wrote about this a while ago, actually, in the newsletter. I think I called it like Ethereum money games or something, where I basically argued that we could use all these games, and I think it was around the time of DeFi Summer when people were obsessed with these rebasing tokens like ESD and stuff like that. And I think I basically said, well, a lot of these things really do look like unsustainable Ponzi's. So while the people play the game, why not take a percentage of the value that's generated by the treasury or the DAO itself and just donate it to public goods? So at least if this thing collapses, it did some good for the world, rather than just like fill the pockets of some kind of like very centralized people, like maybe a few people, the core team or whatever, or maybe even the core team loses all their money or something like that. So I think from that perspective, my view and my thoughts on that is just a very, very positive way to do these things, but it needs to be sustainable as well. You can't basically just say, well, we're going to spin up this kind of like Ponzi game. It's going to collapse in a week, but in that week, we're going to try and collect as much money as possible and then donate it to public goods. That's okay, I guess, but then eventually people kind of like clue into that and say, well, I'm not going to play this game if I know I'm going to get absolutely, wrecked within a week. Maybe they will. I don't know. Maybe people are just so degen, I don't even know anymore. But I think like having a sustainable way to do it, and having like a roadmap, and having people actually working on things outside of just getting the money is really positive. So that's why I was really excited about Klima, and I still am excited about Klima, but it's going to have to kind of like have their model proven out over time and see kind of like what happens. I know the token price itself has been incredibly volatile, and I've warned about that a lot on both the Refill and in the Discord channel, where I basically said like expect this thing to be volatile, because as much as it's doing good, it's still a kind of like money game using rebasing. It is still going to be very volatile and be subject to the same kind of whims of that reflexivity that pretty much like every rebasing token is subject to. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question there, Rob Dog. All right, a long one here from Patrick, who says, you mentioned a couple of times that you were interested in an Ethereum bear case. I don't have a clear bear case, but I do have a bear thought. I would love to hear your thoughts about it, especially because you and Bankless and some others are talking a lot about modular blockchains. So here it goes. I'm researching the Solana ecosystem right now, and as you know, they put a lot of emphasis in their marketing around their capabilities to scale. And as you also know, they had the approximate 17 hours outage the other day. Are you aware that they had something similar a couple of days ago again when the Ori ICO started? Why do I bring this up? To bash on Solana? No. Since you're talking so much about modular blockchains, you're basically talking, as far as I understand, about the fact that those blockchains will be able to execute on the need for high amounts of transactions. So my bare thought is, what if those blockchains fail to deliver those higher transactions and they go offline or down, just like Solana? Remember, Solana is placing a big bet on their transactions advantage. Why would any other blockchains be able to handle it if a really well-funded blockchain company is not able to make it with a war chest of multiple billions? Thank you. So I actually wasn't aware that Solana went down the other day due to the Ori ICO. I don't even know if that happened. I have to double check on that. I do remember the Solana team basically telling maybe it was the Ori ICO, maybe it was another one, not to go live because they were scared it was going to crash the network. But I'll have to check on that. But I think what you may be getting confused about here is comparing a layer 1 and a layer 2. So the reason, or at least like one of the reasons, or a major reason why Solana at layer 1 with all their capability went offline is I mean, and to be clear, this can happen at layer 2 as well, but essentially what they're doing is they're trying to do everything. They're trying to do consensus, they're trying to do transaction kind of like sequencing and execution, just like Ethereum is doing at layer 1 today, but they don't have, or they didn't have, any way to throttle the demand, because they say, oh, we can do 50,000 transactions per second, the transactions are really cheap, you can just kind of like flood the chain with transactions to try and, and it won't break, essentially. Well, it did break, because what ended up happening was that the bots flooded the kind of like, Solana doesn't have a mempool, but essentially the bots flooded the network and basically caused the validators to go offline because they were essentially denial of service attack. They couldn't handle the load. They couldn't process everything. They couldn't process the consensus, executing the transactions, because there was just such a huge burst of it that it kind of like sent the network offline. Now, to be clear, this can happen on layer 2, and it actually has happened, I think, before, or at least Arbitrum did go offline, their sequencer did go offline. I don't know if it was because of a similar kind of like consequence of transactions flooding the chain, but it definitely can happen. It's more expensive on Arbitrum because of the fact that on layer 2 in general, because of the fact that layer 2s have to post call data to Ethereum, so they have a fixed cost anyway, and you'll have noticed that layer 2s aren't as cheap as something like Solana, but the way Solana has kind of quote-unquote fixed this is that, one, they've said to validators, well, you need better hardware, right? Because if you have better hardware, it's less likely that your validator is going to be kicked off the network or go offline or be, or be overloaded. Okay, cool. The hardware requirements were already insane, but now it's even more insane. And two, I don't know if it's implemented yet, but they were talking about implementing a quality of service control, which essentially what it does is it looks for what the network deems to be spam transactions and drops them. Because what ended up happening when it went offline was that a bot basically sent like a lot of transactions to try and get into, I think it was like an IDO or something like that, and it sent like 400,000 transactions. And that's what overloaded the network. So essentially what this quality of service or QoS would do would be to drop transactions that it suspects are spam. But by doing that, essentially what it's doing is it's censoring, because you're basically, or, it's not direct censoring because it's not someone there, pushing the button and doing it in a kind of like in a totally centralized way. But what you're doing is you're choosing which transactions can and can't be processed or can and can't be executed because you suspect that, some of them are spam. I honestly don't like that. I think that it is something that works really well in a centralized ecosystem. Like, for example, a lot of databases or a lot of kind of like websites, they use quality of service like this. You'll probably see something like Cloudflare. They do this to prevent DOS attacks, because obviously you don't have to pay anything to access these websites. So botnets can typically come together and basically spam a website with hits, and what Cloudflare tries to do is detect that and drop that and make sure that those things those kind of like things can't hit the website. Now, obviously, if you try to do that in a decentralized ecosystem, it's a bit different, because if you're claiming that you're fully censorship resistant, well, I mean, are you? If you're basically indirectly censoring transactions, because of your quality of service mechanisms. So yeah, that's kind of like the background on that, and like what I've seen in terms of fixes. But just to your point about like why would this happen at layer 2, it can. But the thing is that if the layer 2 goes offline, and this is the beauty of the layer 1, layer 2 thing here, architecture, I should say, is that if the layer 2 goes offline, if it goes completely offline and never comes back online, and it's architected correctly, you can still withdraw your funds from layer 1. And we've seen this play out before. As I said, like Arbitrum went offline, at least their sequencer went offline. Their validators didn't. So what you could actually do is you could either withdraw your funds from layer 1 Ethereum, or you could submit transactions to the they call it the inbox, the Arbitrum inbox on layer 1, and those transactions would still be executed as part of the Arbitrum system because their validators were still online, but you would be paying layer 1 gas fees instead of layer 2, for example. So you'd just be paying normal layer 1 fees. And you can't, that's the beauty of that system. So you're basically separating the concerns, right? Because layer 2s don't have their own consensus. They're using Ethereum for consensus. And Ethereum is very, very limited at layer 1. So it's very, very, very hard. It's not impossible, but it's very hard to knock the Ethereum network offline with a DOS attack. Ethereum has suffered these things before, like the Shanghai DOS attacks in late 2016 was a DOS attack that didn't take the Ethereum network down, but slowed it down a lot. And basically, it made the Ethereum network pretty unusable for a little while. It was still online, but it was very slow to process blocks and things like that. So it can happen. But as I said, that's why Ethereum is scaling in this layered approach, because we can keep layer 1 ticking. We can keep the settlement layer, the kind of like security layer, ticking no matter what. And even if these L2s go offline or fall over, it doesn't matter. So whereas with Solana, it went offline for, as you said, like 17, 18 hours, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't withdraw your funds. You couldn't kind of like access your funds. You couldn't do any DeFi transactions, nothing at all. And that is not what you want. That is not what you want from a global settlement layer. That is not what you want from an ecosystem that settles trillions of dollars of value a year. Having anything kind of like fall over for that long a period of time is not good. And Ethereum has always favored liveness. And even the ETH2 design favors liveness. And what I mean by liveness is basically having the network up and online for, as much as possible. So yeah, hopefully that gives you background on all of that and answers your questions around that. I think that, this falls into obviously the modular blockchain stuff that I've been talking a lot about, and why that design is really the future and why it allows us to have the best of all worlds. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Patrick. Got one here from Apollo. I'll invite you on stage, Apollo, and you can ask your question.
Hey Anthony, how's it going?
Hey mate, what's going on?
Yeah, not too much. So I had a question about I guess the curation of like crypto jobs and like DAOs and DAO contributor positions. Um, so I feel like there's just so many like different opportunities right now in crypto that I'm kind of like overwhelmed with the amount of choice. So I'm like finding it hard to pick a single DAO that I want to contribute to. So I guess my question would be, what do you think? Do you have any advice for like the best way to evaluate like different DAOs and different opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm with you in that. Like, I see all the opportunities right now. I see all the DAOs and all the teams, and obviously it can be very, very overwhelming. I mean, as someone who keeps up with the ecosystem, I know exactly how much is going on, and yeah, it's totally overwhelming. But I think in terms of deciding which DAO you want to be a part of, what team you want to work for, what project you want to work on, it really just comes back to, what do you want to do? Like, what have you done, in before crypto? What have you kind of like been drawn to within crypto? What do you have fun doing? Those kind of questions are obviously very personal, and you have to kind of like ask yourself those sorts of things. And then once you have maybe an answer to that, or at least like an idea about it, you can start looking for projects that match that. and say you want to be part of a truly kind of like decentralized organism, sorry, I should say organization, such as, I mean, I know I talk about the Index Coop a lot, but essentially they are a pretty strong DAO with a lot of moving parts going on. Then maybe that appeals to you, and maybe you want to work on DeFi and index products and stuff like that. But maybe that doesn't, maybe that doesn't appeal to you. Maybe you would rather work with more early stage DAO, something that basically just has a core team of people that are in the process of becoming a DAO, in a process of decentralizing over time, and you enjoy the bootstrapping phase more than you enjoy the maturation stage. So there's that aspect as well. Or maybe you don't want to work for a DAO at all right now. Maybe you just want to work for a centralized team building something. That's another option. There's a lot of those teams still out there. There's a lot of new teams. I mean, I think another question to ask yourself would be, what stage of a project do you want to join? Do you want to join like a brand new project that just raised a seed round, that is just really getting started? There's only like, there's less than 5 people on the team. Or do you want to join a mature project that has billions of dollars of kind of like TVL and has a token already and has like a massive community and is in the process of like making sure their DAO can tick long term and stuff like that? So yeah, those are, I guess, like a bunch of questions I would ask yourself before really trying to find what you're into or diving into it. Because once you have the answers to those kind of questions, you can essentially map it to the projects out there, and then you'll have probably a much easier time filtering through which projects appeal to you and which ones don't. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that's at least what I would do if I was in your position. So I'm not sure on your background what you've kind of done before crypto, but that would obviously play a big part into it as well. Like, for example, it's funny because like I actually came from a technical background before I joined Set, but I joined as a product marketing manager because essentially what I had been doing before I joined Set was a lot of, I guess, like marketing of myself on Twitter and growing myself on Twitter, growing ETH Hub and things like that. So I actually found out that I really enjoyed the marketing community side of things, whereas I was actually working in cybersecurity before I joined Set. So very, very different field, obviously. And then I personally wouldn't. I love DeFi and I love finance related things, but I don't know if I would work in another kind of like DeFi company. Maybe I want to work in something with Web3, or maybe I would want to work in something with like the social tokens or stuff like that. So yeah, it really just comes down to what you want to do. Because I've written about this in the newsletter before. If being passionate about something allows you kind of to really enjoy your work and really be motivated to do the work and get a lot more out of it. But if you're working on something that you just aren't having fun with and aren't passionate about, it just becomes very hard to motivate yourself to do anything, and a little bit depressing. And I've seen people kind of like fall into that. Even though they love crypto, they end up working for a team or a project that just doesn't jive with them, and they have to kind of like start from scratch again. So I think just asking the questions, making sure that you understand where you actually want to go and what you actually want to do and are interested in before trying to find a team or a DAO is probably the best path forward.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, mate. All right, back to the sheet here. So Project 2501 is asking another question here. Appreciate that there are risks with using bridges and that each bridge has its pros and cons and risk level, but would be grateful to know what the risks are for using the direct Arbitrum Optimism bridges as opposed to, say, Connext and Hop. And are Arbitrum Optimism the closest you can get to risk-free bridging currently? I would say yes. I would say the native bridges for these L2s are the closest and will probably forever be the closest you can get to a risk-free bridge, because as I've mentioned plenty of times, the other bridges all have their own way of doing things. They either do a cross-chain exchange, they either do a kind of like message relaying protocol, or they do I mentioned it on the refill the other day, a cross network, which is doing like short-term loans for bridging. They all have their own trust assumptions, trade-offs, risks associated, whereas the official bridges will always be more secure than those kind of things. And right now, as I mentioned before, Arbitrum and Optimism are very centralized. They have centralized controls and multisigs and admin keys, all that sort of stuff. I don't know how much that applies to the bridge contracts. I'm sure it does apply in some way, but I don't know what kind of control they have over it. But assuming that it's in their final state where they don't have any kind of like multisig and no admin keys, then yes, it would be the most risk-free way to do it. But obviously, there's a drawback here. With the Arbitrum and Optimism bridge, it is a 7-day withdrawal period. With the ZK rollups and things like that, you don't have that 7-day withdrawal period, but you still have a longer withdrawal time. It's still longer than instant, right? It varies from kind of like ZK rollup to ZK rollup, and it varies even more with things like Validiums and stuff like that. I think on Immutable, it's taken me probably up to 12 hours sometimes to withdraw to L1, which is Immutable is a Validium, so. And I think it also depends on a variety of factors as well, like how much activity is happening, because obviously when you withdraw, you have to kind of like pay fees and stuff like that. So how much activity is happening, when's the last time they posted like a batch to L1, all that sort of stuff kind of comes into it. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, the most risk-free way is always going to be the Optimism, the official kind of like bridges or the native bridges. All right. Question here from Axiomatics, who says, do you think CBDCs are likely to come? And if so, do you see them deploying using centralized or decentralized tech / ledger? And what effects might this in turn have on our current stablecoin and DeFi ecosystem? And then you link to an interesting take by the Reserve Bank of Australia here, which obviously I'm not going to read out. But so, I mean, CBDCs are already here. China has a CBDC and it's been using it for quite a while. The US is very interested in it. Europe is interested in it. Australia has talked about it. So I don't think it's a matter of like, are they likely to come or not? They're already here and they're coming. To your second point, do I see them deploying using centralized or decentralized tech? I mean, I think the answer is pretty obvious. It's pretty much going to be centralized. But where different kind of like countries diverge here is that I think China's CBDC is going to be like 100% centralized forever. They're not going to allow you to do anything with it besides kind of like interacting with it on the rails that they control. Whereas a CBDC in maybe a Western democracy, such as the US or somewhere in Europe or Australia, maybe they basically say, well, you can use this CBDC on any network you want to. You can bridge it to Ethereum and use it on Ethereum, right? For example. But I don't think the actual CBDC itself is going to be native to Ethereum. I think it will be built on some kind of like centralized server database, and you'll be able to kind of have like an IOU on Ethereum for it. Maybe they do a roll up or something. That'd be amazing. Actually, if they did a roll up, it would make everything so much easier. And then, yeah, if it was on Ethereum, you'd be able to use it within DeFi, of course, and it would be a challenger to other stablecoins and stuff like that. But I mean, most of the other stablecoins are already centralized, like USDC and USDT, completely centralized stablecoins, Paxos, stuff like that. I think Paxos renamed themselves to like USDP or something like that. But yeah, I mean, they would just compete with those kind of things there. Now, could they be bigger? I mean, of course they could. Like, and maybe the central banks and the governments basically say, well, you can't issue stable coins that are tied to our native fiat currency because we're doing that, and basically kill the competition. I don't know if they would do that. Maybe some of the countries will, but I don't imagine somewhere like the US doing that because it would just like, I mean, not only would it push a lot of innovation away from the US, but it would also kind of go against their stance so far, where they seem to be, I mean, they're not taking a hands-off approach, but they seem to be kind of like talking a lot about doing a lot of things, but not actually actioning on it because it's just so much, I mean, within the US, there's so much kind of like deliberation that has to happen on these things, and there's so many people pulling it in different directions. So yeah, it remains to be seen kind of like what that's going to look like. But I would just like, I think it's safe to assume that CBDCs generally are just going to be totally centralized. I mean, it's called central bank digital currency, right? It's in the name. So yeah, that's kind of like what I would assume going forward. Just take a quick drink break here, guys. All right, going through the questions. So you're on the phone asks, is it fair to say that Loot is the first Metaverse NFT? I think all NFTs are metaverse NFTs, right? I mean, that's the whole point, is that you can kind of basically take your NFT as it exists on Ethereum and place it into any kind of like metaverse that gets spun up, whether that be something like, I don't know, Decentraland or then there's a few others right now. There's also like galleries and stuff like that. So I would say that in maybe you're kind of like referencing the fact that loot kind of like lends itself to having a world built on top of it, and that means that that world could be like a metaverse or something. Maybe. I think that if you take that view, it could be considered the first kind of quote unquote metaverse NFT. But I think all NFTs are metaverse NFTs, to be honest. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. All right, one here from Andreas who says, a multinational that for almost 2 decades was considered the online public square with quantifiably negative results has, in an act of evil genius, co-opted the meta cultural meme. But copyrighting the word and associating it with a corporation actually is a form of cultural occupation, as they effectively just laid legal claim to the metaverse as a form of virtual reality. Should the community try and reject the word or just accept that their subculture's hangout spot just got turned into a McDonald's? This is interesting. I hadn't thought of this before. This is gonna be an interesting one to answer. So I think that I don't think within crypto we've ever called it meta, right? We've always called it metaverse. So if they've copyrighted the term meta, then I don't think that's actually like a big deal, because I don't see the crypto community ever using the term just meta. But obviously there is going to be a connection between that term and the term metaverse. But there were some people that kind of like reacted to this and said, well, okay, instead of calling it the metaverse, let's call it the hyperverse instead. I think Dom, the original creator of Loot, said this. I don't know if the hyperverse would catch on. I think terms like this, once they're ingrained into people's minds, they just take a life of their own, and it's very, very hard to change them. So I would say that metaverse is probably here to stay. I don't think that Facebook is going to be able to co-opt this. I think that it's kind of like a weird thing to think about, right? Because if they do co-opt it, it means that their metaverse kind of like ecosystem has basically been very successful. They've been able to kind of like onboard their billions of users into it, and they've been able to convince them that, you know, the Facebook metaverse is kind of like the metaverse. There's no other metaverses out there, and Facebook is basically the driver of the metaverse ecosystem. It'd kind of be like people saying, well, or some people saying, you know, the internet is Facebook to them, because maybe all they use is like Facebook. Maybe all they use is like a couple of other websites, and that's quote unquote the internet to them. But really, we all know the internet is actually, you know, a bunch of different things, not just Facebook or not just one or a handful of websites. So just like maybe that's what's going to happen with the term metaverse, or with kind of like the narrative surrounding that. But it's very, very hard to tell. I don't think Facebook is going to be the only company or the only major company focusing on this. I'm sure a lot of the other ones have seen this and are kind of thinking to themselves, wow, we have to get involved with the metaverse. And there's already been some of them, like Epic Games, for example, have been kind of like talking about this for a little while. There are a lot of big companies getting involved with the NFT scene, like, for example, TikTok and ESL with Immutable X, and there's a bunch of others that Disney as well, actually. So when you think of it from that perspective, I would say that maybe Facebook is trying to co-opt the term, because I mean, I think a lot of people agree that Facebook as a company is pretty pretty shitty and pretty evil. But I would say that it's going to be hard for them to kind of like, unless their metaverse is extremely successful, I think it's going to be hard for them to convince enough people to kind of like view Meta as like the dominant metaverse, and kind of like, I guess like, what's the term I'm looking for? I guess like co-opt is probably the right term here. But yeah, as I said, it's hard to know right now. It's too early to tell, I think. But those are probably just my general thoughts on that topic. All right, so one here from Dom who says, it seems like a higher ETH price equals more on-chain activity equals more Gwei per gas equals even more USD per transaction. For example, if a transaction costs $50 now and the price of ETH doubles, is there any reason to think the transaction will still cost $50, or will it also double to $100? So this is a common misconception that people make on how the gas fee market works on Ethereum. It doesn't work off of the Ethereum price. Yes, Ethereum price being volatile in either direction will cause on-chain activity to spike, which means that the fees will logically go up. But that is kind of like what causes the fees to go up, the activity, the on-chain activity. So the more demand there is to use the network, the kind of like higher the gas prices go. Now, the perfect example of this is like an NFT drop. When an NFT drop happens, the ETH price could either be flat or going down, but gas prices shoot up, right? So it's got nothing to do with the actual ETH price in that context. But if for example, the ETH price doubles and say the gas price stays at 100 Gwei. Say the ETH is $4,000, gas price 100 Gwei. ETH is $8,000, gas price 100 Gwei. Then yes, in USD terms, the gas price will go from, if it was $50, it will go to $100. But the ETH denomination will stay the same. So the amount of ETH you will pay for that transaction will be exactly the same. But because the ETH price has gone up, yes, you will be paying in USD denomination more. Now, in saying that, it could happen in the opposite direction as well. If the ETH price doubles, but network activity halves, you will be paying the same fee that you were paying, right? If ETH goes to $8,000 and you were paying a $50 fee at $4,000 and the network activity halves, you will be paying a $50 fee at $8,000 because, as I said, network activity is detached from the ETH price. It is measured in ETH terms, not the ETH USD price, and it is dependent on, what's happening on the network at any given time. So hopefully that kind of like clears that up. I know it can be counterintuitive and it can be something that trips a lot of people up, but it's probably, it's funny. I think it's got to do with a lot of the, not a lot, like all of the gas, websites basically showing the USD denomination. Because if you look at Gwei is obviously not ETH. Gwei is a billionth of an ETH. So if you look at Gwei and say, okay, well, this transaction is 100 Gwei, you don't know what that is in ETH, and you don't even know what that is in USD, but the sites will show you this is what it is in USD. But a lot of them won't show you what it is denominated in ETH because most people just don't think like that. Whereas if you start thinking of gas fees in an ETH denomination, then the price of ETH becomes irrelevant to that. So I don't know if that's the right way to think about it or if it's the wrong way to think about it, but it is the way the network thinks about it because the network doesn't know what USD is. The network knows what ETH is, and that's how it denominates gas prices. And as I said, on-chain activity is what causes gas prices to go down. Oh, sorry, demand for Ethereum block space is what causes the on-chain activity to go up or down, which means the fees go up or down there. All right, a question here from Brian Peace who says, I sometimes hear discussions or debates about Ethereum's level of decentralization at the networking layer. For example, are Infura and Alchemy potential points of centralization? Are IPFS and Filecoin alternatives to AWS? Or more broadly, what does the ideal end state look like for a maximally decentralized network, and what are the biggest hills we still have to climb to get there? So I would say that Infura and Alchemy are points of centralization insofar as they're just like transaction relays. So for example, MetaMask defaults to Infura. Whenever you send a transaction with MetaMask, it is using the Infura infrastructure to relay that transaction to the network. So what can Infura do? Well, they can censor you, right? They can basically say, well, I don't want to process this transaction from this address. I'm going to censor it. They can also go offline, and that means you won't be able to do any transactions unless you change your RPC on MetaMask to your own full node or to another provider. You won't be able to get transactions through because you're piggybacking off another node, for example. And the same applies to Alchemy and all the other similar providers, of course. And then you ask, are IPFS and Filecoin alternatives to AWS? On the data storage side, yes. On the compute side, no. So AWS, I guess, is the data storage and compute. I don't know. I think Filecoin wants to do compute, but right now it's more of just like data storage. So I would say that like it's more of an alternative to something like a Dropbox than an AWS. And then you said, or more broadly, what does the ideal end state look like for a maximally decentralized Ethereum network? The ideal state for Ethereum to be maximally decentralized is for every user to run their own full node and to use their own full node to process their transactions. Now, of course, this is not viable. This is not practical. This is not something that should be expected of end users. And then, so what's the next best thing if we can't get every user to run a full node? Run a light client. What's a light client? Well, a light client, which is coming with stateless Ethereum and is part of like an effort that Ethereum is going through right now, what this does is it allows you to still ensure that you get like a similar security to a full node without having to download and keep the whole kind of like active state of a full node in place. So it's very, very lightweight. And in terms of teams working on this, there is obviously the Ethereum core research and dev team itself working on it as part of the Stateless Ethereum roadmap. But Lodestar from ChainSafe is trying to be a client that can be run as a light client and be run on kind of like hardware such as a smartphone. So the ideal end state is basically having a robust light client ecosystem that allows you to have similar security properties and guarantees to running your own full node without having to run your own full node and being able to relay your transactions using that instead of relying on a infrastructure provider such as Infura. So yeah, that's kind of like what it looks like and how I guess like Infura and Alchemy and those services relate to centralization and decentralization. All right, one here from Amit23. Hey, Anthony, in the daily Gwei refill, you mentioned that you run multiple nodes to stake your ETH, and it's the most secure and trustless method. I'm interested in setting up and maintaining self-hosted Ethereum nodes. I wanted to check what are the best options available to get started with this. I've set up my own Bitcoin node on Raspberry Pi in the past using Umbrel. Is there an Umbrel-like solution available to run a node for Ethereum network on Raspberry Pi? So for those of you who don't know, Umbrel is like a private server that you can have. And there is a kind of like thing that is very similar to Umbrel within the Ethereum ecosystem called DApp node. So what DApp node is, it's basically a thing that you can install on... I mean, you can install it on anything really, and kind of like run it, and then you'll be able to kind of like have a nice little graphical user interface that allows you to essentially have like a one-click deployment of nodes. So you could one-click deploy an Ethereum full node, an ETH2 validator, an ETH2 beacon node, and I'm pretty sure you can do that on a Raspberry Pi as well. I have to check if they, I'd have to check if they support Raspberry Pis. But yeah, that node is similar software to Umbrel. So and yes, you can run validators on Raspberry Pis as well within ETH2, which is really, really cool too. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. But also, if you want more color around kind of like all the options to you, there's a really great article in Bankless. I think it's titled Running an ETH2 Validator for the Barely Motivated by Justin LaRue. If you want to just Google that, you'll be able to come across it. And it's in the Bankless newsletter. It was a really great read about, I guess, running ETH2 validators on different hardware and running different validators and kind of like, I think there's a DApp node guide in there as well. All right, a question here from Marquis who says, along the theme of monolithic modular blockchains, it seems that you could already adapt a layer 2 scaling solution using the beacon chain as the consensus layer. Why are the current L2 projects, Arbitrum and Optimism, ZK Sync, etc., not doing this? Or maybe they currently are developing and testing this, or maybe there is some fundamental technical problem. Now that the beacon chain is stable, L2 projects should be using it to provide the consensus layer. Why do we have to wait for the merge to occur? Maybe this has already been discussed, but would like your views on this. So it's not currently possible because all the beacon chain is doing right now is coming to consensus on itself, really. Coming to consensus on, just empty blocks because there's no transactions being processed, nothing. Because they can't be. It doesn't have a virtual machine. It doesn't have a way to store call data. You can't store kind of like call data on the beacon chain itself, and you can't store proofs on the beacon chain, so you can't use the beacon chain as your consensus layer for kind of like these L2s. You need like an execution environment, for example. So from that perspective, could we do it? Could we add like an execution environment to the beacon chain? Yes, you could. You could enshrine an EVM or a light EVM in the beacon chain to be able to directly like bypass, I guess, like the ETH1 chain altogether and just use the beacon chain. This is an idea that's actually been discussed. I'm pretty sure there's an ETH research post about it, but I don't see it happening until after the merge, to be honest. And maybe it doesn't happen at all because maybe it adds too much overhead to the beacon chain, because the whole point of separating out the consensus layer and the execution layers is that we want the beacon chain to be as lightweight as possible because the beacon chain already has a lot to deal with and a lot to keep track of, and we don't want to add more complexity and load to it that is necessary. So it may not happen, but it's definitely an idea that's been floated around already. But yeah, it's not possible today, unfortunately. All right, a question here from Tom Decent who asks, with Immutable X, if they crash or go offline, can items be recovered via some escape hatch? I understand that they store some data off-chain, but is the data required to prove ownership or just extra metadata? If items can't be recovered, is it an L2 secured by Ethereum? So as I mentioned before, immutable X is a validium, which means it stores its data off-chain. If their off-chain data availability, or wherever they're storing their data off-chain, if that goes offline and you can't access it, then you can lose your funds, in that your funds will be frozen because you won't be able to use that escape hatch on layer 1 because you don't have the necessary data to use it. So yes, this is why people are calling a validium not a true L2, because a true L2, by the classical definition, always allows the user to withdraw their funds from layer 1. They don't need any extra data from any other sources. Whereas with a validium, you do, obviously, because the data is stored off-chain. So while the data is available to you, of course, you can use that escape hatch. You can withdraw to layer 1. But if that data kind of availability committee goes offline, then you won't be able to, unfortunately. So that's the trade-off. And the trade-off is made because you want to achieve more scale, right? Like you still get some security from Ethereum because you're posting the transaction proofs, the batches to layer 1. So it's still better than like a different chain, for example. But the trade-off is that you get massive scalability at the cost of, security. Maybe security is the wrong term, but I guess like the cost of basically being able to withdraw your funds at any time, because if it went offline, then you'd have to wait for it to come back online to get that data. Or if someone else had the data and they were withholding it from you, then they could be censoring you, stuff like that. But in return, you get basically free transactions. Like immutable X is free because they cover the gas costs because they're so low. Because the most expensive part of a layer 2 securing itself on Ethereum is posting call data. The posting the batches of the transactions is extremely cheap, and they can get cheaper over time because you can compress those and with BLS signature aggregation and similar techniques. Whereas the call data, the only way to get more to have cheaper call data costs is sharding, and obviously that's not coming for a little while. So I would say that Validium and similar constructions are maybe short to medium term solutions until we get to a point where we have enough shards to basically make it so that storing call data is trivial on layer 1. But that's the kind of like the trade-offs there. And also, you should go to l2beat.com. They explain everything about the trade-offs, the security concerns, everything for every L2. They are amazing. So definitely go check out l2beat.com, and you'll get a full breakdown there of everything. All right, last question from Adam Ross on the sheet here. Then I'm going to check the AMA series channel for additional questions. From listening, I know that bridging exposes you to the bridge contract. My question is, if from mainnet you use Binance Bridge to BSC, then use Connex to bridge from BSC to Arbitrum, then sell it to mainnet. If, say, Connex gets hacked, or are your funds at risk still, or is it only based on the last bridge you used? So this is where things get a little bit murky with bridges and complex. I think the simplest way to explain this is basically explaining how kind of like native assets differ from foreign assets. So for example, ETH on Ethereum is native, right? ETH is issued and secured by the Ethereum network. It is native to Ethereum, and any ETH that gets taken off of Ethereum to go to another network is considered foreign ETH. So for example, when you send your ETH to BSC or to the Polygon POS chain or even to a layer 2, it is foreign to that network. It is not native. So let's use a simpler example than your example, and then I'll kind of like dig into yours just to illustrate my point here. If you bridge across your ETH to the Polygon POS chain, that ETH is not technically bridged. It is an IOU. You lock your ETH in a bridge contract on layer 1 Ethereum, then you get minted these IOU ETH on the Polygon POS chain, and you can go do whatever you want with it from there. But the thing is, if the ETH in the Polygon POS chain's contract was to get drained or stolen, or if the contract was for some reason to bug out and just get frozen and no one could interact with it anymore, your ETH on the POS chain, but logically, should be worth 0, because your ETH on the POS chain is an IOU. It is not your actual ETH. It is not ETH recognized by the actual market. Now, so now would it actually go to 0? Maybe not. It would probably be valued at some premium on the POS chain. But the thing is that you can never bridge that ETH back to Ethereum from the POS chain to get native ETH. You'd always be stuck with this derivative, this IOU. that you bridge it across, because you can't actually unlock the official ETH or the native ETH on the layer 1 chain, on the Ethereum layer 1. So from that perspective, that's just like a basic example of why it's not actually a bridge. It's more like, I mean, I don't even know what the right analogy is, to be honest, because a bridge literally means you're crossing the bridge. You exist in one state at the start of the bridge, and then you bridge to the end. So you walk across the bridge, and then you're at the end of the bridge, and you exist in another state. Whereas the way kind of like the bridges in crypto work is that you're basically saying that, okay, well, I'm going to, stay at the start of this bridge, but then I'm going to basically clone myself to the other side of the bridge, but myself at the start of the bridge isn't able to move unless the clone comes back and kind of like merges with me. Maybe that's not the greatest example analogy, but that's what I'm coming up with at the top of my head. So to your question about like bridging from Binance to BSC, then from Connext then using Connext to bridge from BSC to Arbitrum, and then sell it to mainnet. It depends on what asset you've bridged. So mainnet, I'm assuming you mean Ethereum mainnet. If the last asset that you got was ETH on Ethereum, then you're not at risk at all, because you have native ETH on the Ethereum chain. The risk is somewhere else. The risk is whoever's got like ETH in maybe the Connext kind of like pools, or somewhere else on one of the other networks, or whatever else, or maybe they've locked it in some other contract. But if you've just got vanilla ETH, it's not in a smart contract, it is literally vanilla ETH in a normal Ethereum wallet, an externally owned account, EOA, normal Ethereum wallet, then there is nothing that can happen to that. That can't be taken from you. It can't, the transactions can't be reversed. You can't be exploited or hacked or anything. Obviously, you can be hacked, and you're in the normal case where your ETH can be stolen. Maybe your seed phrase gets compromised, but in terms of the bridges, no, they pose no risk to you anymore if ETH was the final asset that you received. Now, where things get murkier is like, okay, what asset did you finally receive? Did you receive on ETH mainnet? Even if you received something that is native to ETH mainnet, such as USDC. If something happens, USDC, Circle, the issuers of USDC, have centralized controls, which means that, say there's a massive kind of exploit, $1 billion of USDC gets frozen or gets kind of like hacked. The Circle, the issuer, can do one of two things. They can freeze those funds and then just reissue the USDC, which is probably the path of least resistance, or they can socialize the losses across all USDC holders, and essentially you might take a haircut. Now, I don't think that would happen. I think the formal case would happen where they would just freeze the funds and reissue the USDC, and then it'd be fine. Like everything would be one-to-one backed again. So, but then, say you kind of like bridge a native asset from another chain onto Ethereum. So you're going kind of like going backwards here. So say I don't know if this is possible. I think it is. Say you bridge across AVAX from Avalanche to Ethereum, and you'd get something like a wrapped AVAX. Well, if the bridge on the Avalanche side is compromised for whatever reason or frozen, then your Avalanche or your AVAX, that's wrapped on Ethereum, then because that's not native to Ethereum, it's in the same kind of like boat. It becomes either worthless or it loses a lot of its value because of the fact that you can no longer redeem it for the actual AVAX on Avalanche. So I guess like the TLDR is that it all depends on what the asset is. And is it native to the chain? Do you actually have control over it, or is it still stuck in a smart contract? Like, for example, if you have ETH in a smart contract on Ethereum, well, the ETH isn't under your control, it's under the smart contract's control. Yes, you're the only one who can withdraw it from it, but that's in the honest case, like the proper case. Say the smart contract has a vulnerability that gets exploited and your ETH gets stolen out of it, well, then it's not your ETH anymore, is it? It's someone else's ETH, right? So, and unless they return it. So it's kind of like just all comes back to the fact that native assets are always kind of like secured by their native chain. So if your ETH is on Ethereum in your own account, nothing can happen to that in terms of like bridges being exploited or anything around that. But if your ETH is on another network, you're reliant on the bridge's security at the end of the day, and you're also reliant on the other network security too. For example, like if, for example, the Polygon POS chain was to go offline, I'm pretty sure this is how the POS chain works. Maybe the POS chain isn't the best example because I'm not totally sure. But for example, BSC. If you bridge your ETH to BSC and BSC goes offline, you can't get your ETH back you can't unlock it on the Ethereum side, so you're at the mercy of the BSC chain. And kind of like similarly for like pretty much most of these side chains. So that actually differs from layer 2s. If you actually use the native bridge to go from layer 1 to layer 2, then you're only at the mercy of the native bridge, and you can always get your funds back out. But if you were to use one of these other bridges, it gets even murkier, because say you kind of like bridge into layer 2 via, I guess, like Connect, Store, Hot protocol or something like that, depending on the asset again, and depending on kind of like the bridge that you're using, there could be some kind of like exploit that happens, or there could be some way where you could lose your funds or lose the value of your funds. So yeah, hopefully that gives you an overview. This sort of stuff gets very complex because of the fact that bridges can talk to other bridges, can talk to other networks, can talk to L2s, can have different assets, can have non-native and native assets, and it's a very big mess. And that's why bridging is both really important to get right from a usability standpoint, but also from a security standpoint, because I do suspect that one of these things are going to get exploited in a really big way one day. It's just in my mind, it's inevitable, and I think we're going to see what happens in that case. Like, and does the exploited funds get frozen if they're centralized assets and get reissued? How do the bridges kind of like exercise centralized control and kind of like try and retrieve some of the funds? How many users get hurt? Like, what happens to the actual native assets? It becomes a bit messy. So I think it's still early days for bridges. We're going to see how that all plays out, but yeah, definitely something to keep in mind for sure. All right, I think someone in the audience wants to ask a question. Sponge, I'll invite you up.
Hey, Anthony.
Hey, mate. How you going?
I was just wondering if you had an explain it like I'm 5 for Rory's schools. Thank you.
For what? Sorry.
Rory's fuse pools.
Oh,
Rory.
Yeah. Got you. I guess which part of it? Like, I mean, I'm not too up to date with Rari, but I know the fuse pools are basically. Are they money markets or yield aggregation pools? Maybe I'm getting confused here. Maybe it's best if you explain to me kind of like your understanding of it, and maybe I can fill any gaps that you have with your knowledge.
I just thought it was like personal money markets, like how Tetranode created his own money market.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think so. I think you've got it right. It's basically personal money markets, and being able to play around with arbitrary assets without having to basically get them approved as collateral on other money markets like Aave and Compound. That's pretty much the limit of my knowledge on Rari's fuse pools. Unfortunately, I think that's been in my backlog for a while to look more into it, because I have seen Tetranode posting about it, but maybe it's worth asking Tetranode. I don't know if he responds to DMs, but I'll look into it more and hopefully have more color and maybe talk. Maybe you can even ask in the Discord channel as well, in the DeFi channel. Someone will be able to answer you better than I can, maybe. All right, onto the questions in the AMA series channel, then I'm going to wrap this one up. So one here from a DJ who says, what will happen to the price of ETH after validators can unstake their 32 ETH? Okay, maybe I don't know if this is something that you're confused about, but I see this kind of like point of confusion a lot in the ecosystem. The merge. So the ETH1 to ETH2 merge, or the consensus execution layer merge, doesn't enable withdrawals. Withdrawals come after the merge, probably 2 to 3 months or something like that after the merge. When the merge happens, no withdrawals can happen at all. For staked ETH, and also no withdrawals can happen for any of the new ETH that is being issued to stakers, and also none of the fees can be withdrawn either. So no withdrawals at all. But when the merge when the withdrawals are enabled about 3 months after the merge, there is actually a hard limit on how many ETH can be withdrawn from the validator set per day. It is currently just under 30,000 ETH per day can be withdrawn, and it goes into a queue. And you can see this queue, it's fully transparent. You can see how much ETH is kind of like being withdrawn. Now, obviously, a lot of people would assume that anyone withdrawing their ETH from staking is going to sell it. I wouldn't be so quick to assume that. I would think that maybe, some of these people just either, a lot of them would probably sell it, right? A lot of them probably withdraw to sell, but there are other uses for your ETH, right? Maybe you want to put it in DeFi or something like that. Maybe you want to restake using one of the staking derivatives because you want to get like ST ETH, for example, and then use that within DeFi. So I don't know what's going to happen to the price, to be honest. I think that it's just going to depend a lot on what the market's like at the time. Like, for example, if has the ETH price gone really crazy? Are we at something like $20,000 before withdrawals are enabled? And was it just going to crash anyway, regardless of withdrawals being enabled? It's very, very hard to tell because we don't know exactly when withdrawals are going to be enabled. I would say that, if we get the merge in June, I'm just saying June. Don't quote me on that, please. But I'm speculating here. But I'm just trying to give a bit of dates here. If we got the merge in June and then like 3 months later we got withdrawals being enabled, maybe it could crash because maybe we went up a lot in price. I don't know. It's very, very hard to tell. So hopefully that gives a bit of color around what withdrawals actually look like, though. All right, last question from Crypto Bunker. I want to know the best way to persuade someone who has never touched crypto to create an Ethereum address. Nothing to do with investing, but just to make an address on MetaMask. What are the best reasons to do that now? I think the best reason for like a totally new person to crypto, it depends what they're into. Are they, do they want to kind of maybe it's a bit difficult because without knowing what the person's into, it kind of like becomes hard to know what to suggest to them. But I would say that if they want to say they have like a bunch of money in their savings account, and right now they're not earning a yield on their savings, right? Because the yields are very, very low in the traditional system. And say they want to like earn a higher yield, well, you can get 10% plus on stables in low risk farms within DeFi. So that would be something that might be interesting to them and might get them to start, and create an Ethereum address. The NFT ecosystem, are they into art? Are they into collectibles? Do they like digital collectibles specifically? Do they want to get more involved in that kind of scene? Are they into human coordination, like DAOs and stuff like that? Are they into social tokens? Are they into being into different communities within crypto? That could be something they're interested in. Do they like maybe the decentralized web side of things? Like you can try to explain to them, hey, there's this, there's this whole kind of like movement to build decentralized web, the decentralized web out in Web3, and there's this thing that you can get where you can set up your Ethereum address, and then you can create an ENS that allows you to assign your kind of like name to your Ethereum address and basically have that as like your on-chain identity or online identifier. So there are a few different things there that people might be interested in, but as I said, without knowing what the individual is interested in, it's hard to suggest something specific. But I would find out what they're interested in, and then find something on Ethereum or an app on Ethereum that they can use and get the most value out of. I think, as I've said before, plenty of times, NFTs are definitely going to appeal to the widest set of people. But I do still think that DeFi, once people realize the yields that they can get in low risk kind of places, especially some of these apps are offering like easy ways to onboard into these low risk yield farms or whatever you want to call them. I think that appeals to a lot of people as well. And they may say, oh, that's too good to be true. And then you can get explained to them, well, no, it's not. It's just this, new financial ecosystem here that we have. And it's not part of the banks. And, sometimes it's a bit hard for people to grok that as well. They basically say, well, I don't trust that because, what happens if I lose my money, blah, blah, what are the protections in place? So from that perspective, we probably still have a very long way to go to kind of like be more normie friendly, I guess, so to speak. But yeah, first step would be figuring out kind of like what they're into, at least loosely, and then trying to find something in Ethereum that maps to that. Because I think there is pretty much something for everyone at this stage. All right, last question here from, I think this is RL, is your name, or RI, or R0I. The BTC ETH Bankless episode raised counter-argument suggesting keeping Ethereum L1 PAL as simple as possible, which eases running a node probably by sacrificing sharding on POS and other heavy data storage activities. How would you approach this question? I would say that this is wrong. I don't really know what PAL and POS and consensus mechanisms have to do with the ability to run a node. It is more about kind of like, as you mentioned, like data storage, or like I guess like the block size, the gas limit, than it is about the consensus mechanism. So yeah, I don't know if maybe you're kind of like mistranslating the question, or maybe that was kind of like what they said, because I know what debate you're talking about. And honestly, the two people on the Bitcoin side don't really know much about Ethereum, so I don't know if I'd really listen to them when it comes to these sorts of things. But I mean, you mentioned sacrificing sharding as well. Well, as I talked about before, the Ethereum network actually gets more decentralized. Gets more scalable with the more decentralized it gets, and we only add more shards if we have more validators. So from that perspective, I don't know. I don't see why it's why we would stay on proof of work. And I mean that's a deeper question as well, like proof of work versus proof of stake, stuff like that. But really, the cost of running a full node is more about the state size, which comes back to gas limit, and more about kind of like the heaviness of the chain than it is about what consensus mechanism you use. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question there. But I think I'm at the end. So unless anyone else has a question in the audience, I'm going to end it there for today. All right, cool. Well, yeah, thank you everyone for joining another Daily Gwei AMA. As I said, this has been recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube within 24 hours. It'll have timestamps and everything attached to it, and we'll do this again in 2 weeks. And I'll chat to you all on the Discord channel. Thanks, everyone.